Good morning, everyone. It's time to get started. Welcome to the live audience in person and also to those joining us online. It's a new quarter, so that means it's a new class. As you can tell from the screen, hopefully you can see it, we are going to begin the study survey of Ezekiel. I think I mentioned to Susan this morning, it's actually a restart. We're not picking up where we were 360 some odd days ago when we had to stop. Somebody took some time off. So we're going to restart it. We were only a few lessons in, so maybe you have forgotten what we talked about a year ago. If not, these first few lessons will be a good refresher. I have been through all of them and I've done a little tweaking, so there'll be a few things that are different. But I'm using the title very directly, Survey of Ezekiel. Because with 48 chapters, it's one of the longer books in the Bible. Besides length, as one of the major prophets, there's a lot of imagery. And content that one is controversial to begin with, and a lot of discussion. And we could study it for quite a while. We could go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years. I don't know how long it might take if we really wanted to go in depth. So we're going to do a survey because I think there is a lot of important information we can glean even in a shorter study. So we will focus on the major points and ideas and try to make some application for us in this quarter. I made this comment a year ago. Some people wonder, why Ezekiel? And that's a good question. Why Ezekiel? And I referred to myself in the choice that I made to want to teach this class. I became a Christian at age 13, and I started thinking through my time. I've grown up in the Church of Christ. My father was a minister. I have never sat in a class on Ezekiel, nor have I taught one. I'm not sure I could find in some of the places we worshiped and attended where we taught Ezekiel. Now, I know what he's taught. I'm just saying I haven't had that experience. And so I decided, it's time. It's time. So we're going to dig in. I've read through Ezekiel certainly several times over my life. But really until I was working on this study, didn't really appreciate what all Ezekiel has to teach us. Because there's some challenging components to it, challenging elements, but if we take some time to look at them and understand them, I think it will work for us. So as far as the schedule, I do have a handout with the schedule for the quarter. If I get someone to pass that out for me. So you'll know where we're going to be going, and you'll have a sense of the breakdown from week to week. And you'll be able to see when you get a copy, some weeks will just be a few chapters that we can easily digest and dig into. And then there's some weeks later on, particularly in the latter part of the quarter, where we're going to have a big chunk of chapters that we're going to work through or we're going to survey over in order to be able to address the main points in the scope of the quarter. But we do have a plan, and so I will do my best to follow it and stay with it and not get too sidetracked as we go along. For any of the folks who are viewing online, and even really for the folks in here, I will be using PowerPoint. That's just the way I operate. I have what I've gotten into, and so I'm going to continue to use it. I do it in my work, and so I'll do it here. And I do have a handout each week. So I've got another copy if I can get some folks to pass that one out when they come back. Oh, thanks, Greg. So week to week, those will be available. And if you would like a copy of the slides, it actually has all my notes embedded in it. You're welcome to them. Just email me, and I'll be happy to send them to you each week as I prepare for the class. And that includes anybody here. If you want a copy of them as well, just let me know, and I'll make them available to you. There's nothing copyrighted or protected in any of the information, and you are welcome to them. The other thing you'll notice, and some people wonder why you do this, when I use handouts, they're partial, which means there's blanks for you to fill in. And that's a throwback to my training as an instructor. Some folks learn best by doing. And when they take notes, they tend to remember things better. So that's why I use handouts that are incomplete, so you can at least fill in a few blanks and then make your own notes as you go along. And if you don't want to use it all, that's fine. You get what you pay for. All right? It didn't cost you anything, so you don't have to invest as you choose not to. Today, as you look at the outline, we have an overview lesson. And these are the elements I'd like to try to work through today. Talk about why we study the Old Testament in general. And that should be almost a rhetorical question. You shouldn't have to think about it. I know why I study the Old Testament. But in my experience, having spent a little bit of time helping with Bible education, I've encountered folks that literally will tell me, I don't like to read the Old Testament. I don't want to study the Old Testament. And so I think it's a question we do need to address periodically why we do it. And some general notes on the prophets and what we can learn globally from them. And then we'll focus more specifically as you drop down on Ezekiel and some of the main themes we'll find there. I'm going to offer some thoughts on the timing of the prophets, and these are certainly not set in stone. And if you've done any reading in another class, we talk about the timing of elements in the Old Testament, there's always some discrepancy. Folks may have different opinions, and that's fine. But I've come up with I didn't come up with it. I have prepared and put together based on some of what I think are labeled the more conservative timing elements of the books and the writings of the Old Testament. Just to help put Ezekiel into a context, so we can kind of see what else had been happening when things were happening, and help us have more of a historical understanding. Now we'll talk a little bit about Ezekiel the man, some of the elements we have from the scriptures about him specifically, and then some of the particular themes from this book that we'll address during this quarter. So that's what we're going to start with today, and then next week we will jump right into the first 3 chapters. But this question of why we study the Old Testament, and I would ask you how you answer that. Why do I study the Old Testament? And that's not a rhetorical question. So think about it and tell me, why do you study the Old Testament?
Well, there's a lot of reasons, but one especially, we really learn about the nature of God and how He dealt with the people. Yeah.
The nature of God and how and why He dealt with people in the manner He did, absolutely crucial. And if you take nothing else from the study of the Old Testament, you learn about God. He teaches us about Himself through the Word that He's given us.
Old Testament provides context for the New Testament.
Context for the New Testament. Context for the New Testament. We don't appreciate fully Christ and what He has done and is doing unless we appreciate where it's come from and why this path that God has designed. Richard? He took your answer. He took your answer. That's okay.
Maybe for a full understanding of the process.
Okay.
Of what God has planned.
A fuller understanding of God's process, His plan for His creation. Very good.
So it gives us understanding for the things Jesus taught.
Okay, understanding for the things that Jesus taught. Because He references the Old Testament, some of the prophets in particular, to show the fulfillment of those words that were given to us. This is one of the big elements we'll see in Ezekiel. God reminding the people, I'm here. And I'm in control. This is going to happen and you're going to experience it. And he got into the habit of thinking, well, it's all in the future. We're not going to experience that. These prophets say things and they never happen. That tells Ezekiel to tell the people, this is going to happen and you're going to know. You're going to know that I am God when it happens in your time. So globally, a lot of those points, I agree with all of them. The Old Testament is meant to teach us. To teach us. See that in Romans 13. How about Romans 15:4? Yeah, that's it. For everything that was written in the past was written to teach us, so that through the endurance taught in the Scriptures and the encouragement they provide, we might have hope. Now, when I first dug into this verse, teach us, that's the focus, that's the point I put on the slide. In the last couple of weeks, as I've been looking at that verse, there's another word that jumps out at me. As you read that verse, is there something else that jumps out at you besides teach? It's supposed to teach us.
Hope.
Hope. How did I miss that? The word is living. Hope. Hope. Through a study and understanding, or trying to better understand what we are learning through the Old Testament. Hope. Because, back to the point Don made, it's teaching us about God, in whom we trust, in our Creator. And that helps us to have hope, the confident expectation of what's coming, of how our life is being directed, of God working in our lives. It gives us hope. Now, part of that teaching is the admonition. The admonition, 1 Corinthians 10:11. These things happened to them being the people of Israel, as examples, and were written down as warnings for us, on whom the culmination of the ages has come. Warnings, admonishment. It's true. It's true. It's real. God is, and the manner in which He dealt with His people is still the manner in which He deals with His people. We want to understand that. Now, we do, in the context of the New Testament, the Old Testament is full of grace. We don't always see it. In the New Testament, it's right in front of us. It's in the Old Testament too, but also the warnings. If we're not in step with God, there's some warnings that we need to adhere to. And that's going to be the big part of Ezekiel. Warnings, warnings, warnings. And then destruction. But then restoration. Process. Someone mentioned God's process. It's all going to play out through the study. Okay, a couple of other subnotes. As we learn about God, we're going to focus more and see about His holiness, His righteousness, His justice, His mercy, that are all on display through this book and certainly through the Old Testament. And this last one, we probably take this for granted. Well, I don't know about you. I won't say for you. I've taken this for granted, I know, over time. Understanding of God's dealings with the nations of men. God works through His creation, all of it. And we'll see specifically, and you should remember this from other studies, God working in the use of nations. Nebuchadnezzar is God's tool to destroy, to take over most of the established nations in that area, we'll see when we look at some of the maps. A lot of the warnings against the nations that we read about is their destruction through the hand of Nebuchadnezzar as directed by God. He just tells us flat out, I'm going to use the Babylonians to bring this about. And so His dealings with the nations of men, again, it's real. He's still there. He's in charge. And for the study of Ezekiel, the Jews had to remember that. They had to be retaught that lesson. Okay, some general notes on the prophets, collectively. Prophets were raised up to call people to remembrance, repentance, and obedience. Those are the three I picked. You could probably come up with some others. But many of the messages, most of the messages of the prophets, you will find these elements. Remember, turn back, obey, obey. Again, some of the major teachings or major themes you find when you read the prophets. Again, the Lord is ruler of all history. The need to be right with God. It's certainly more important to be with God than any other place. In the context we'll see with the prophets in Ezekiel, not those human allies. You remember the history of Israel, both of Israel, the northern and southern kingdoms. When they were threatened, they were under attack. A lot of times, let's go get a partner. Let's go find another kingdom to help us fight our enemy. Okay? But God repeatedly told them, I've got the battle, trust in me. This may be a bit more esoteric, but the moral foundation of religion and society. And again, we're going to be studying Ezekiel, but if you go back into Jeremiah, he makes it very clear, it's very clear in those writings, that there's no true religion without morality. So to be right with God, we must live in obedience. That's not a new lesson. We must live in obedience to God, to His standards, His commands. In obedience to God, following in, again, the path and process He's designed for us, the life He would have us live, also then puts us in right relationship with one another. If I am right in endeavoring to live in His will, that will naturally extend out to my relationships with other people, because He's directing me, directing us, is how we live. I think, man, that sounds a lot like the New Testament. It does, doesn't it? Because God is consistent. And it's all in the Old Testament too, if we look for it. If we will dig in and see what He's teaching us. And that's some of the challenges, I'll be honest, of studying the prophets, reading through them. Jeremiah's long. Ezekiel's long. You get kind of tired, and some of the imagery and the history, the background, you got to stay with it. But when you dig into it, you realize, oh, it makes more sense. It's something I didn't do last year that God directing things in my life, that happened this year in the last couple of months. In working on the class, and then a daily reading schedule, I'm doing a chronological reading of the scriptures. Well, I happened to hit Jeremiah about the time I'm in the midst of Ezekiel. Well, I've been in the midst of Ezekiel. And we'll see it a little bit later this morning. They're contemporaries. And so as you read Jeremiah, you get really the two sides. Jeremiah is talking to the folks in Jerusalem. This is what's happening. This is what's going on. Ezekiel's talking to the folks in captivity about what's happening in Jerusalem, what's coming for them, and then prophecies for them as well. But to see that play out, Jeremiah is living it as Ezekiel's prophesying and telling the people what's happening. It's fascinating to put those together. We don't have the time in a survey to do that, but just for your own edification, perhaps you might want to read some of Jeremiah as we go along. Now, some of the edits I'm trying to make as I find these interesting crossovers, I'll make in the notes, point them out for you, and hopefully you can go back and look at them yourself. A few more major themes. The combination of judgment and hope. Okay, because God is in control. He's leading the nations of men. He judges men. And a lot of times that judgment, particularly in the Old Testament, is to their destruction, to their end because of their disobedience. But for those that are in that right relationship, there's also always the message of hope. Hope always follows judgment, or opportunity for hope is almost always there. For God's people, certainly. And we'd be remiss, as we talked about already, the Messianic kingdom. Okay? Certainly the prophets speak a lot to what is coming, to the future that God has prepared for his people. It's portrayed in a lot of different ways. We won't get into all the imagery, but things like the new covenant, revolving around the person who we know as Christ, the new David, God on David's throne, the servants, a lot of different images that are given about the Messianic kingdom, filled through the prophets. And extremely important for us. And as the point that Lee made, Christ stresses the messages from the prophets and how important it is for us to know. He made it clear that we can't understand him, we can't really know the full, again, teaching, as someone pointed out, without appreciating the word that's in the prophets. Okay, so some of the big ideas. If we study the prophets, we're going to learn. You will learn, ideally, if you will study them and read them. Okay, a few things about some of the nuts and bolts on the prophets. What do we have in Scripture? We've got the four major prophets: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. You ever put words together, come up with new words? Yeah, why not? 12 minor prophets. I'm cheating, I've got it written down. Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. Still, to this day in my head, that song keeps running whenever I say the names of the prophets in the books of the Old Testament. So you got to teach the kids that song. It'll stay with them. And of course, the designation notes length, not importance. So here's your bonus question. I asked this a year ago, almost a year ago. Who is generally credited with using these labels? And I have no idea if it's true, but I've read several folks point to the same person and say, yeah, this is the one that he started. He called them major prophets and minor prophets. See, none of you were in class a year ago, right? Yeah, gotcha. Augustine. I have no idea if that's true or not. Not a clue. But several historians believe it, so yeah, why not? It doesn't matter. It really doesn't. But it's a fun tidbit if it's true. Of course, there are other prophets named in the Old Testament that don't have books. Elijah, Elisha, Nathan, just to name a few. Samuel, many recognize as a prophet, even though his writings are connected with books of history instead. But they could be. Okay, the timing of the prophets. Again, I'll put the disclaimer out. This is an approach to understanding. There's lots of discussion, you can read all kinds of opinions on when the books are dated. Some are easily dated in historical context, some are not. And so this is one approach to putting them together to give us a sense of how they fell or worked together. And the labels I use because they're around, again, what's happening in the book of Ezekiel and preceding it from a historical context. So what's called, quote unquote, the early Assyrian period, around the 9th century, we have Obadiah and Joel. Again, if you get into the readings and some of the controversy of them, some will date these two books quite a bit later, in the 500s instead of the 800s. But within the context of the history of God's people, this would have been during the divided kingdom, with Israel to the north, Judah to the south. And the north then of Israel, you would have the Assyrian Empire, making its presence known and growing during that period of the divided kingdom. And then moving into the 8th century, where they exert more of their influence and their effect. And of course, in 722, the Assyrian Empire destroyed the northern kingdom, taking them into captivity. Oh, it would help if I would move this slide. There we go. So in this period, we have Jonah, Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, Micah, and various prophets associated with that time period in the northern kingdom. Moving on to the Chaldean period, during the 7th century, of course, with the Babylonians, they would eventually defeat the Assyrians and most of the other nations, actually all the nations around Israel, as a collective, extending their empire. The prophets served as God's messengers during this period, particularly the Babylonian Empire, when they threatened the kingdom of Judah. So you have Jeremiah, Zephaniah, Nahum, Habakkuk, and these cross over into the exile period, as Babylon does defeat and take over these nations, and certainly within the context of Israel or Judah at this point, and God's people exporting them to Babylon. And the key figures for us, Daniel and Ezekiel, contemporaries, both taken into captivity, although at different times. So the prophets in Babylon working, God using them for his purposes as his messengers, both to the captives and to the other nations. Okay, speaking to them. Of course, we know from Daniel all the work that he did in speaking to Nebuchadnezzar. Yes, go ahead.
This time of the Assyrian period, are we to infer that those 10 northern tribes that were scattered abroad, that these prophets were scattered with them? Pretty much at all.
So Richard's asking, as the northern kingdom, as Israel is taken into captivity, are the prophets taken with them as well? I have no idea. I really don't know. Some could have been. We know we have the example with the Babylonian captivity, that certainly those prophets were in, two at least, were in Babylon. Jeremiah stayed in Jerusalem. But some of them don't know. We know Jonah was told, go to Nineveh. So they certainly interacted in these other spaces. But I don't know. Could be. God was able to use them wherever they were at.
Well, you know, the 10 northern tribes, once they were scattered, they were all out. They were no longer going to be figured in. Have anything to do with Messiah or line that comes through and like that. They were basically lost to God.
Yeah, so what you're saying is the northern tribes, as the northern kingdom was dispersed, taken into exile, and those people were spread out with the Assyrian Empire. And as that breaks down and people moving around and going back, do they come back? We don't have specific references. Well, that's not true. We do have some elements. Some of the prophecies talk about people coming back from all around. Clearly, the return from Babylon is the direct repopulation of Jerusalem. With those that stayed, then you have a lot of the foreigners as well that were in Jerusalem and around coming in.
I understand that when those 10 northern tribes were dispersed, they did not allow those Jews to keep the lineage in line. That's the big difference.
Yeah, right. We have no record of, from
Babylon
Sure.
did allow Judah for sure to keep the lineage in line because it was promised by the Messiah that
Right.
he was going to come to that line.
Sure, they kept their record of lineage, and part of that, when we go into studies of, I'm blanking on the names of the Bible. What's the other book I taught? The other e-book. Ezra, thank you. Ezra and Nehemiah. Wow, isn't that sad? He's completely lost it.
Get used to it. It gets worse.
It gets worse. That's it's a foreshadowing of what's to come. So when we study Ezra and Nehemiah, we know they kept the records to the best of their abilities and extent. Now, some of those were still in Jerusalem, so you still have Jews in the land residing and coming back. There you go ahead.
You also, in the previous slide, were denoting the Assyrian period as opposed to they were there in the northern kingdom. You notice most of the prophecies predate the 722, 721 conquest, which would then result in the dispersion. And then Isaiah and Micah are prophets to the southern kingdom just simply during that time. So what happened to them afterwards? They either died or were dispersed if they were in the northern kingdom. They just didn't rise.
Right. And to the other point, Richard, coming back, I mean, we've got 70 years of exile, so who was still alive? And of those family lines, they've even thought to come back or wanting to come back, we have no idea. No idea. But we know from the southern tribes, the two tribes, that lineage was retained coming back. And it was a big deal to know your family lines, because that's where the land, to get your land back, as they repopulated in return. But clearly they weren't all there, because you didn't have 12 tribes return at that point. Okay. And then one more. There we go, the post-exilic. So as we finish out the time period of what we think of as the Old Testament, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, as the Jews returned to the land, to the Promised Land from captivity, God used Haggai and Zechariah to encourage, again, the rebuilding of the temple. Later Malachi to help reform the priesthood during the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, of course, in their activities. See, but I just turned the page. I got them written down there from in front of me. All right. And again, one of the things, I know we've talked about this in other classes. I've never done it, and I'm not sure if anyone else has. Trying to do some crossover study, like I mentioned earlier, where you have the contemporaries and their writings and matching them up. That would be a great study. I'm not volunteering to do it, but it would be a great study to be able to put that together. All right, let's talk a little bit about Ezekiel more specifically, some of the historical and political context. As we were just saying with the Assyrian Empire, the northern kingdom had been taken into captivity around 722, 721, depending how they're dating it. The southern tribes were spared, of course, for a little bit longer with some good rulers, and of course we know there were some bad rulers. Hezekiah, one of the better rulers, followed up by Manasseh, arguably the worst in the reign of the southern kingdom. Introduced idol worship, or reintroduced it, went as far as offering children as human sacrifices and worship to Molech. His son, Ammon, continued worshiping of idols in the land of Judah, and just that path of sin and debauchery. Quick side note, Manasseh I wish I knew more about him. I wish we had more information, because there's a tremendous paradox with him. He was the worst, and then he repented. And a lot of times we don't think about the second part. Oh, actually, he repented of all of that. Still had the consequences of his sins. And Israel was, or at that point, Judah was set. Their path was determined by that point in time. But he did repent. So that's interesting, again, character in the history that we still don't have much information about. And of course, Josiah restoring proper worship to Judah and to the tribes. Reigned for 31 years, got rid of the temples, the idols' temples, destroyed the high places, and restored the proper worship of God. Followed by Jehoahaz, who only ruled for 3 months, brought idol worship back to Judah before being taken away as a captive to Egypt himself. And this back and forth, as we get into particularly some of Ezekiel's prophecies. Again, if you haven't read it a whole lot, one of the things we're going to see is God lays out the case in detail of why they're where they're at and what's going to happen to what remains in Jerusalem. The destruction of the temple, and why he's departing, why he is letting them experience all of this suffering in detail. And again, we haven't spent some time going through it, but all these kings, that's it. We have the record in the kings of what they did and why they upset God so much. In Ezekiel, you get his story, his expression of what this did to him, to the extent we can understand. Just to the extent we have Lamentations of Jeremiah. In Ezekiel, you get a little bit of God's lament this is what you did. This is why this is happening. And these kings just illustrated, they lived it out. And we have Jehoiakim ruling for 11 years. The 4th year of his reign, Daniel was taken to Babylon, the first exile, with, again, some remaining. And we have Jehoiachin taken to Babylon in the second exile, and this is when Ezekiel would have been taken, as best as they can tell. He was part of the second deportation to Babylon.
The first trip,
Mhm.
that you did, that first trip,
Yep.
that was the time that
Daniel was taken in the first, that's true.
was one.
Yep. Yes, Daniel would have been taken to Babylon before Ezekiel. And we'll get into that timing just a little bit more in detail. I think it's next week. We'll look at that when we talk about Ezekiel. And it's important to place him in Babylon because he's there for a few years before God calls him to service.
That's very important.
It is important. Although there's no sense that the two ever cross paths because they're in very different places. You have Daniel serving in the king's domain, and you have Hezekiah who's not even in the same city with Daniel. Okay, and after Jehoiachin, we have Zedekiah installed as king and ruled till the destruction of Jerusalem. He ruled for about 11 years, and following that, Jerusalem, of course, was destroyed, and then the destruction of the temple to follow as well. Well, they destroyed it there as well. Mm-hmm. Yep.
One thing I think about Zedekiah is you have to realize that they were being ruled by Babylon. He had to pay tribute. It wasn't like he had free reign.
Right.
He had, he kind of told everyone what to do because they do kind of what Babylon.
That's right. He was installed by the Babylonians. He was a vassal for Babylon, and then he rebelled. And when you rebel against the strongest empire at that point in history, or in their time, there are consequences. And we'll see in Ezekiel some of his prophecies are about Zedekiah, and what he does, and then the consequences for his actions. Because again, the folks in exile would not know what's happening. So the prophecies help inform them to know where things are coming together. Of course, the Babylon captivity then, at this point, 70 years, and that's defined around the time periods, and we'll look at those dates again also as we go along. That's one of the key messages for Ezekiel to the people in captivity. This is for real, and this is going to be a while. Settle in, build your houses, live, because we're not going home next week. We're not going back. This is going to last. Because many were thinking, well, this won't be that long, or this is just temporary. No, 70 years. And this will all tie back to, we'll look at some of the imagery and the essence of the time elements, the Sabbaths, the Sabbath rest for the land that they never got, that, again, in theory, came through the captivity. The book itself, or the writings of Ezekiel, cover a 22 to 23-year time period, depending on how you play with the dates. Or which dating you believe. The timing of the book itself, when we meet Ezekiel, when we begin to learn about him and his experiences and God calling him and the messages he begins to receive, are about 6 to 7 years before the total destruction of Jerusalem. Okay, again, remember the exiles, the first, the second. There's still people living in Jerusalem under the reign of the kings put in place by Nebuchadnezzar. And so he's going to address that before the destruction of Jerusalem. And this is one of the elements of the prophecy I mentioned earlier. God's telling people, this is going to happen in your time. You're going to get the prophecy, and then you're going to see the fulfillment of it. Well, the destruction of the temple was one of the big ones. Okay, that this is happening, and you're not going back anytime soon. Okay. And then we have, for the remainder of the book, 15, 16-year time period following that destruction, and the messages that are given. A lot of them dealing with the prophecies to the other nations, what's going to happen there, and again, God's sovereignty over all nations, not just Israel. And then the foretelling of the hope of what's to come. This is also an important part of what we'll see in the latter chapters of Ezekiel. There's a lot going on. You got to stay with it. You got to work with it, and you got to do some reading to keep up. Okay, what we know about Ezekiel. Not a lot. This comes from the book itself. Okay, in chapter 1, verse 3, he's the son of, I'm not sure if that's Buzzy, I've heard both. You use your voice-activated Bibles, and you might get both. So, depending on who's reading it. Yeah, Buzzy, I don't know. Son of Buzzy. Could be Buzai, or maybe there's a whole different pronunciation for what we see as the U. I'm not going to pretend to know. All right, the name means God will strengthen. Ezekiel means God will strengthen. And there's a specific reference early on where God tells him, I will harden you because you're going to be dealing with a very hard and stubborn people. And so you need to be just as hard and to be able to resist them, to give the messages you're going to have to present to them. God will strengthen. Again, if the dating's right, he would have been taken to Babylon when he was about 25 years old. Again, during the second captivity, around 597-ish, just after 600. He would have been then 17 or 18, again, depending on the timing, when Daniel was taken to Babylon. Again, remember, he was taken in the second captivity, so he wasn't quite that old just yet. If we accept the timing that's in the book, and we believe it's accurate, from chapter 1, verse 1, he was called to prophesy then at age 30. So he's in captivity for about 5 years before God presents his message to him, or his presence to him. And that's what we'll see in chapter 1. If you remember from last year, this is probably one of the most, I think, incredible images of God displaying his presence, his power in person, or to a person in his vision that he receives. To give him a sense of God's divine presence. And gets his attention. And he sees it more than once. That's also interesting. And we'll point those out as we go along. He was married, but we don't know anything about his family. And we only know he's married because God tells your wife is going to die. Don't mourn her. You know, again, he's symbolic, and he's presenting messages to Israel, or to the Israelites in captivity. But that's all we know, that he was married. And his wife died. And as we've already pointed out, he was a contemporary of Jeremiah, who was still in Jerusalem, Daniel in Babylon, and then Zephaniah, Nahum, and Habakkuk. And I will be honest, I haven't gone and looked at those last three to see where some of the crossover might appear, or might see some of the elements that help with context of the others as well. But again, just to put it into a sense of what's happening here. Or what else was happening. When you read some of those other books, you realize, oh, okay, those are all still related. Okay, some of the themes in Ezekiel. We'll come back to, again, the sovereignty of God, the holiness of God. When you read the Old Testament, and when you're reading the prophets and studying them, there's a presupposition. God is sovereign. That's almost just taken for granted, that God is, and he is in control. And again, Ezekiel lays it out very clearly, and we'll see that. As I mentioned earlier, from the first chapter, the graphic description of God's presence in Ezekiel's vision, it's astounding. And I'm not a particularly good person at illustrating things, and so I rely on others. Can you kind of give me a sense of what that looks like? And when you see some of those that have vivid imaginations and how they might be able to portray it, it's like, wow. And that's probably not very accurate either, if we're honest with ourselves, because we just don't know what this looks like in the spiritual sense. But if it's even anything close, it's quite amazing. In the book of Ezekiel, these two phrases, or these two statements, the first one, then they will know that I am the Lord. Depending on translation, it might be worded slightly differently. But it occurs 65 times. Okay, and so when something is repeated over and over, again, the importance of it is being conveyed. And then the statement, thus says the Lord, appears 64 times. 64 times. And so God is telling Ezekiel, is telling the people, this is my word, this is what's going to happen. And this is just a simple breakdown of the book in three different components, but relating to this point of God's sovereignty. In the first 24 chapters, we learn that God will be revealed in the fall of Jerusalem and in the destruction of the temple. Okay, because God is going to tell them this is happening. This is going to happen, and then it happens. Okay, so his foreknowledge, his design. In chapters 25 to 32, we learn that the other nations likewise will know God through his judgments. Okay, again, as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, just briefly, part of Ezekiel is the pronouncements against the other nations, God's prophecies about what's going to happen to them as well, again illustrating his sovereignty. And then in chapters 33 through 48, we have the promise that God will be made known through the restoration, both of the renewal of Israel, specifically going back, but then the spiritual Israel with the coming of the Messiah. Okay? Laying out God's in control. Again, if you take nothing else from studying Ezekiel, God's sovereignty. Okay? And now back to what we talked about from 1 Corinthians, that hope. The hope from studying and understanding what we learn. Another big theme is going to be the sinfulness of Israel. Regardless of the fact that they were the chosen people, Ezekiel taught them their sin. He explains to them vividly through the messages God gives him why they were now unworthy of his blessing and in need of repentance. In need of repentance. He does this in two different ways, generally, at least kind of the way I'm thinking about it. He brought their sins to their attention, and this is really God bringing their sins to their attention through stories and parables. We'll see in Ezekiel what's referred to as the parable of the Foundling. We have Israel's history portrayed as the cycle of disobedience is referred to again and again. And then you have a very vivid imagery of the allegory of the two sisters that portray both the northern and the southern kingdoms, and just the idolatry that they commit. And it's quite graphic, to be blunt. And so, as we look through there, we'll keep it G-rated for the audience. But he uses very vivid language to portray the betrayal. And I think the imagery is very important for us to really understand. Wow, that's again is God's sense of this is what you've done to me. This is how you have treated me. This kind of very vivid and graphic imagery to help them see this is what your sin is like to me. And so we'll look at that as we go through. And then more specifically, and again, I think this is for me, one of the more interesting visions that Ezekiel has of what happened, particularly around the temple and their degradation of the temple, both through the idol worship and through their disdain of God while they're in his holy place. And this will be early on. We'll see that in chapters 8 through 10, where he addresses that very specifically. And this is one of the other kind of side notes I hadn't really thought about, again, until you dig into a book. Ezekiel really focuses a lot on their sin as it associates to their worship to God. Not just social sins and just sin in everyday life, but the sin around their relationship to God specifically and what was to be their worship of him and how they defamed, degraded, just walked away from their worship of God. And so we'll see that very vividly. In contrast, Amos talks more about the social sins and some of the problems, like dishonest weights and their dealings with one another, injustice, elements that are certainly wrong. But Ezekiel's really about their worship, their lack of proper worship to God. And you can't get away from judgment, okay? Ezekiel is very much about God's judgments. And it was not a mere threat of what's going to happen. It's now happening for them. In chapter 12, God specifically tells them, the words which I speak will be performed. You will see this. It will happen. And so they know it is there. And then it comes full circle with the promise of restoration. That those that are repentant, there are individuals that will enjoy the salvation of God through a restored community, a fellowship of believers, both specifically in that time as those in captivity were able to return, to rebuild, and then certainly the promise of Messiah, looking ahead to the kingdom that God would establish and the spiritual restoration that would come from the work of the Messiah. And so we'll try to deal with all of that in just 13 weeks, 12 now, as we go forward. Richard?
This promise of restoration, I've never thought understanding that, because a few short years after he made these promises, Jerusalem was sacked.
Yes, it was.
Off the face
destroyed it. Babylon destroyed it.
You know, they're prophesying restoration. I don't understand how they do it.
Well, he's telling them a remnant will return. And they did. He's telling them there would be some that would go back, that he would restore them, those that return to God, to worship to God. And if you want to get into real strange mind games, it's like, okay, God accepted their worship in captivity, even though they didn't have their sacrificial system. They weren't able to go to the temple and make the sacrifices. But it was about the spiritual worship and the condition of their heart. And then their return to him, their lives to him. Then return back. And then they did. They restored, all right, we'll rebuild the temple. And then we will return to our worship of God. And we know, okay, they did. And then they continued to take it in a direction that he didn't intend. But from the return, I know Lee's mentioned this before in some of his lessons, and you've probably heard in other classes, the idolatry we see in the desecration before captivity wasn't a problem for the Jews after captivity. They didn't have the high places. They didn't have the idol worship. Now, they didn't properly worship God as he designed for them. And we get into the New Testament now, all the crazy laws and rules of the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the way they distorted their worship of God or the worship of God. But we don't worry about high places anymore. They learned that lesson. But the group going back, is that the struggle with? Yeah. Now, not everyone went back, of course, because some would have died in captivity. But his promise to the nation, I will bring my people back.
Well, I think different people will have a different definition of restoration. I think they're looking at the example of the whole nation.
Probably. Could have, because we know they distorted.
They, surmised from that statement, I think.
Could be.
It was far.
We know they had a different view of the Messiah as well. They wanted a physical. We got a new king. We're going to be established. We're going to overthrow Rome, etc. Yeah. Could have. I don't know. I wasn't there with them. I can't read their minds. All right, so next week, appreciate your time and attention today. We will pick up with chapters 1 through 3. Ezekiel's call to prophesy and God's presence of him presenting himself to Ezekiel to say, here I am, and here's what I want you to say. And so we will pick up then. Appreciate your participation, and we'll see you next week.